I pulled into my driveway after a long day at work, ready to finally relax, when I noticed a bright orange cone sitting right in the middle of the concrete. My pulse quickened as I saw a woman in her mid-40s standing on my lawn with a clipboard, wearing a blazer that screamed, "I need to speak to your manager." She had that particular haircut, the one that defies gravity and common sense, and her lips were pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "Excuse me," I called out, stepping out of my truck. "Can I help you?" She turned to face me with an expression that suggested I had just committed some heinous crime. "You must be Frank Zimmerman. I'm Deborah Patterson, the new HOA president. We need to discuss your property immediately." I felt a knot forming in my stomach. I had lived at 847 Maple Ridge Drive in Scottsdale, Arizona for 3 years now, and the HOA had always been relatively quiet. A few notices about lawn maintenance here and there, nothing major. But the tone in Deborah's voice told me that was about to change. "Okay," I said slowly, walking toward her. "What seems to be the problem?" She thrust a piece of paper at me, her manicured nails nearly stabbing me in the chest. "This is an official notice that your driveway has been designated as emergency vehicle access for the neighborhood. Effective immediately, you can no longer park any vehicles here between the hours of 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. I stared at the paper, reading the words but not quite believing them. "I'm sorry, what? This is my driveway, I park here. That's what driveways are for." "Not anymore," Deborah said with a dismissive wave. "The HOA board conducted a review of emergency access routes, and we determined that your driveway provides crucial access to the main road in case of fire or medical emergency. The neighborhood needs this access point." I looked around, completely bewildered. My house sat on a corner lot, and yes, my driveway was positioned such that it connected to both Maple Ridge Drive and the smaller Oak Street, but it was still my private property. "Do you have an easement for this? Legal documentation?" Deborah's eyes narrowed. "We don't need an easement. The HOA has the authority to make decisions for the safety and welfare of all residents. This is for the greater good." "That's not how property rights work," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "You can't just claim my driveway as public access without legal documentation and my consent. I own this property." "You own this property subject to HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions," she fired back. "I suggest you review your documents. Now please move your vehicle to street parking." I took a deep breath, counting to 10 in my head. It's 4 in the afternoon. Even by your ridiculous timeline, I have until 8 p.m., and I'm not moving my truck because this entire thing is absurd. Deborah's face flushed red. "Mr. Zimmerman, I strongly advise you to cooperate. The board can levy fines of up to $500 per day for non-compliance with HOA directives." "Fine me," I said, walking past her toward my front door. "I'll see you in court." I heard her sputter something behind me, but I was already inside, door shut firmly. My hands were shaking as I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter. This couldn't be legal. It absolutely could not be legal. I spent the rest of the evening digging through my home purchase documents, the HOA bylaws, and every scrap of paper related to my property. I read through the CCRs twice. Nowhere, and I mean nowhere, was there any mention of emergency access easements or the HOA's right to commandeer private driveways. The only thing even remotely related was a clause about maintaining clear access to your property for emergency services, which was standard everywhere. At 8:15 p.m., my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Deborah standing there with another woman I recognized as Linda Marsh, the HOA secretary, and a tow truck idling behind them on the street. "Mr. Zimmerman, your vehicle is in violation of HOA emergency access restrictions," Deborah announced. "We are authorized to have it towed at your expense." "Like hell you are," I said, stepping outside. The tow truck driver, a heavy-set man in his 50s, looked distinctly uncomfortable with the whole situation. I walked directly to him. "Sir, do you have legal authority to tow my vehicle from my private driveway?" He scratched his head. "Well, the lady there said it was HOA business and she'd pay the fee." "This is my private property," I said clearly. "No easement exists that would give anyone else rights to this driveway. If you tow my truck without proper legal authorization, that's theft, and I will file charges and pursue civil damages." The driver looked at Deborah, then back at me. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble. If there's a dispute about property rights, I'm out." He climbed back into his truck and drove off. Deborah's face had gone from red to purple. "This is obstruction of HOA operations. I'm levying an immediate fine of $500, due within 10 days. Send it to my lawyer," I said. "Along with documentation of the easement you claim exists on my property." Linda pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of my truck. "Documenting violations," she muttered. "Document whatever you want," I replied. "You're standing on my property without permission, by the way. I'm asking you both to leave now." They huffed and stalked off, and I watched them go with a mixture of anger and disbelief. This was insane. Absolutely insane. The next morning, I took a personal day from my job at the construction firm and went straight to a real estate attorney's office. I had called ahead and gotten an appointment with Martin Reese, a lawyer who specialized in property disputes and HOA issues. His office was in downtown Scottsdale, a modest suite in a professional building. Martin was in his 60s, with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. I laid out the entire situation for him, showing him the notice, the photos Linda had been taking, and my property documents. He reviewed everything carefully, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. After about 20 minutes, he looked up at me. "Mr. Zimmerman, this is one of the most blatant cases of HOA overreach I've seen in quite some time, and I've seen a lot." "So I'm not crazy?" I asked. "Not even remotely." "An easement is a legal right to use someone else's land for a specific purpose, and it must be recorded in the property deed or established through legal proceedings. From what you've shown me, no such easement exists. The HOA cannot simply declare your private driveway to be emergency access." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "So what do I do?" "First, we send a cease and desist letter to the HOA, making it clear that they have no legal right to your driveway and demanding they rescind this ridiculous policy. Second, we file for a declaratory judgment to establish, on the record, that no easement exists. Third, if they attempt to fine you or take any other action, we countersue for harassment and abuse of authority." "How much is this going to cost me?" I asked, dreading the answer. Martin leaned back in his chair. "I'll be honest with you. Legal action against an HOA can get expensive, but the HOA also has a fiduciary duty to all homeowners, and if they're using community funds to pursue frivolous actions, the other homeowners might not be too happy about that. Sometimes just showing you have competent legal counsel is enough to make them back down. And if they don't back down, then we take them to court and we win. This is as clear-cut as property law gets." I hired Martin on the spot. He drafted the cease and desist letter that afternoon, and we hand-delivered it to Deborah's house that evening. She answered the door in yoga pants and a tank top, clearly not expecting visitors. "Deborah Patterson?" Martin asked professionally. "Yes." "I'm Martin Reese, attorney for Frank Zimmerman. This is a cease and desist letter regarding your unlawful claim to Mr. Zimmerman's driveway. You are to immediately rescind all notices, fines, and restrictions related to his property. She took the letter, skimmed it, and her face went pale. The HOA has every right to make decisions for community safety. The HOA has no right to seize private property without proper legal easements, Martin replied calmly. If you proceed with this action, we will pursue legal remedies including but not limited to injunctive relief, declaratory judgment, and damages for harassment. I strongly advise you to consult with the HOA's attorney before taking any further action. We left her standing in the doorway, letter clutched in her hand. I felt good about it for approximately 12 hours. The next evening, I came home to find my driveway blocked by a large wooden barrier, the kind they use for parking lot construction. A sign attached to it read, "Emergency access only, no parking, violators will be towed." I sat in my truck for a full minute just staring at it. Then I called Martin. "They did what?" he asked, his calm demeanor cracking slightly. "Blocked my driveway with a wooden barrier. I can't even get to my garage." "Do not touch it. I'm documenting this. Take photos from every angle, get timestamps. This is going to help our case significantly." I spent the next 20 minutes photographing the barrier from every possible angle. My neighbor across the street, an older gentleman named Bob Chen, came out to see what was happening. "What's all this about?" he asked, gesturing to the barrier. I explained the situation and his eyes widened. "That's your driveway. They can't do that." "I know." "They're claiming it's emergency access." Bob shook his head. "I've lived here for 15 years. There's never been any emergency access issues. The fire department has clear routes through the entire neighborhood. This is ridiculous. Would you be willing to provide a statement to that effect?" I asked. "Absolutely. Deborah and her new board have been causing problems for everyone. Last month they tried to tell me I couldn't park my RV in front of my own house, even though I've done it for years and it's perfectly legal." This was interesting information. I wasn't the only target of Deborah's power trip. The next day, Martin filed for an emergency injunction to have the barrier removed. We had a hearing scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, I had to park on the street and walk around the barrier to get to my front door. It was humiliating and infuriating in equal measure. Deborah seemed to be emboldened by her success with the barrier. She started showing up at my property at random times, taking photos and making notes. Once I caught her actually measuring my driveway with a tape measure. "What are you doing?" I demanded, coming out of the house. "Documenting the dimensions of the emergency access route for our records," she said without looking up. "Get off my property." "This is community property now." "No, it is not. This is my private property and you are trespassing." She finally looked at me, and there was something almost manic in her eyes. "You don't get it, do you? The HOA serves the community. Individual property rights are subordinate to community needs. We're creating a new standard for HOA governance, and you're going to comply whether you like it or not." "I'll see you in court," I said, pulling out my phone to record the interaction. She noticed the phone and quickly walked away, but not before I got her entire speech on video. The hearing for the emergency injunction arrived. Martin and I sat on one side of the courtroom, while Deborah, Linda, and a nervous-looking attorney named Paul Fletcher represented the HOA. Judge Rebecca Morrison presided, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with a reputation for cutting through legal nonsense. Martin presented our case succinctly. The HOA had no legal easement. They had blocked access to my private property. They were attempting to seize property rights through administrative fiat rather than proper legal channels. He submitted photos, documentation, and the video of Deborah's rant about community property. Paul Fletcher stood up to present the HOA's position, and I could tell he was struggling. Your Honor, the HOA board exercised its judgment in designating emergency access routes for the safety of all residents. The bylaws give the board broad discretion in matters of community welfare. Judge Morrison looked at him over her reading glasses. Counselor, does your client have a recorded easement on Mr. Zimmerman's property? Not a recorded easement, Your Honor, but the board resolution serves as authorization under the HOA's governing documents. Show me where in the governing documents the HOA is authorized to create easements on private property without owner consent and without proper legal recording. Fletcher shuffled through papers. The bylaws state that the board can make rules for the health, safety, and welfare of the community. Making rules about noise levels or lawn maintenance is quite different from seizing property rights, Mr. Fletcher. You know this. The HOA is willing to negotiate compensation for the easement, Fletcher tried. That's a tacit admission that an easement doesn't currently exist, Martin interjected. You can't negotiate compensation for rights you already possess. The HOA is attempting to create an easement retroactively, which is not legal. Judge Morrison nodded. I've heard enough. The barrier is to be removed immediately. The HOA is enjoined from interfering with Mr. Zimmerman's use of his driveway pending resolution of the underlying property dispute. If the HOA wishes to pursue an easement, they need to follow proper legal procedures, which includes negotiation, fair compensation, and recording the easement with the county. Court is adjourned. I wanted to cheer. Martin just nodded professionally, but I could see the satisfaction in his eyes. We walked out of the courthouse to find Deborah waiting on the steps. This isn't over, she hissed at me. Yes, it is, Martin said firmly. The barrier comes down today or you'll be in contempt of court. I suggest you accept defeat gracefully. She stormed off, and I finally felt like I could breathe again. The barrier was removed that afternoon. I came home to find Bob and several other neighbors standing in my driveway, having apparently removed it themselves. We figured we'd help speed things along, Bob said with a grin. Plus, a few of us wanted to have a word with you about Deborah and the board. I invited them all inside. There was Bob, a woman named Susan Torres from 2 streets over, and a younger couple, Jennifer and Marcus Webb, who lived at the other end of the neighborhood. Deborah has been out of control since she got elected president 4 months ago, Susan explained. She's fined me 3 times for having my trash cans visible from the street, even though they are behind a fence. She's telling Marcus he needs to repaint his house because the color is not in keeping with neighborhood aesthetics, even though he just painted it 2 years ago, and it was approved then. She tried to tell us we couldn't install solar panels, Jennifer added. Said they were visually unappealing and would lower property values. We had to get a lawyer to point out that Arizona has solar access laws that supersede HOA restrictions. How did she even get elected? I asked. Bob grimaced. Low turnout. Most people don't pay attention to HOA elections. Deborah and her friends Linda and Carol Anderson ran as a slate, promising to increase property values and maintain standards. They got in with maybe 30 votes total out of 200 homes. So most people don't even know what's happening, I said. Exactly. We're thinking it's time to change that. Over the next few weeks, we organized. Bob set up a website documenting HOA overreach. Susan started a petition to recall the current board. Jennifer and Marcus went door to door talking to neighbors. I provided my story and documentation as a case study in what was going wrong. The response was overwhelming. Turned out, Deborah and her board had been making life miserable for dozens of residents. One elderly couple had been fined for having non-approved flowers in their garden. A single mother had been threatened with legal action because her son's basketball hoop was 2 inches taller than regulations allowed. A veteran had been told he couldn't fly the American flag on certain holidays because it created visual clutter. The stories were endless, and people were angry. A recall election was scheduled for 6 weeks out, but Deborah wasn't going down without a fight. She doubled down on enforcement, issuing fines left and right for the most minor infractions. She hired a compliance officer, a surly man named Keith, who drove around the neighborhood looking for violations. She even started sending letters threatening liens on properties for unpaid fines. Martin advised me to document everything and not engage directly. "Let her hang herself with her own rope," he said. "The more unreasonable she becomes, the stronger our case gets." Then things took a darker turn. I woke up one morning to find that someone had spray-painted HOA violator across my garage door in bright red letters. I immediately called the police. Officer Daniel Hayes responded, taking photos and a statement. "Any idea who might have done this?" "I have a pretty good idea," I said, explaining the ongoing dispute with the HOA. "That's civil, though. This is criminal vandalism." But without evidence directly linking someone to the crime, it's hard to prosecute. "I'm getting security cameras installed this week," I said. "Good idea." I called a security company that same day and had cameras installed covering my entire property. 4 cameras with night vision, motion detection, and cloud storage. It cost me $1,500, but it was worth it. The cameras paid for themselves within a week. I caught Deborah on video trying to place an orange cone in my driveway again. The footage showed her looking around nervously, then quickly placing the cone and hurrying away. I sent the video to Martin. "This is good," he said. "It shows a pattern of harassment. Keep collecting evidence." The next incident was more serious. I received a certified letter from a law firm I didn't recognize, claiming I owed the HOA $7,000 in fines and fees, and that they were proceeding with a lien on my property. I immediately forwarded it to Martin. He called back within an hour and he was angry. "This is fraud. The fines they're claiming are either fabricated or for violations of rules that don't exist in the actual HOA bylaws. And they can't place a lien without going through proper legal procedures, including notice and an opportunity to dispute the charges." So, what do? We file a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate. HOAs are required to follow specific procedures for fines and liens. This violates multiple state regulations. We also send a strongly worded letter to this law firm letting them know they're participating in fraudulent activity. Martin drafted the complaint and the letter. The law firm backed off immediately, claiming they had been misinformed about the nature of the dispute by the HOA. The Arizona Department of Real Estate opened an investigation. The recall election was getting closer, and Deborah was getting desperate. She called an emergency HOA meeting, which she was required to notice to all homeowners. The meeting was held at the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance. I arrived with Martin to find the room packed. Easily 150 people had shown up, which was unprecedented for HOA meetings. Deborah sat at a table at the front with Linda and Carol, looking distinctly uncomfortable with the turnout. "This meeting is called to order," Deborah said, banging a gavel. "We have several items on the agenda, including new architectural standards and increased enforcement of existing rules." "Point of order," Bob called out from the audience. "Before we discuss any new business, I'd like to address the recall petition." "That's not on the agenda," Deborah snapped. "It doesn't need to be on the agenda. The bylaws state that any homeowner can raise concerns during the public comment period. We haven't reached public comment." Then I move to open public comment now. Seconded, someone else shouted. Deborah looked flustered. You can't just move to change the agenda. Martin stood up. Actually, under Robert's Rules of Order, which your bylaws specify as the governing meeting procedure, a motion to amend the agenda is allowed and takes precedence. You need to call for a vote. Deborah glared at him but called for a vote. It was overwhelmingly in favor of opening public comment. Bob stood up and addressed the room. As many of you know, there's a recall petition circulating for the current board. We've documented numerous instances of overreach, improper fines, harassment of homeowners, and violation of state HOA regulations. Tonight, I'd like to give people a chance to share their experiences. One by one, people stood up and told their stories. The elderly couple with the flower fine, the single mother with the basketball hoop, the veteran with the flag. A man who had been fined for having his garage door open while he worked on his car in the afternoon. A woman who had been threatened with legal action for having a wreath on her door that was too large. The stories went on for over an hour. Deborah kept trying to interrupt, to call people out of order, to shut down the discussion. But the crowd wasn't having it. Finally, it was my turn. I stood up and calmly explained the driveway situation, the illegal barrier, the attempted towing, the harassment, the vandalism, and the fraudulent lien attempt. I had printed copies of key documents and I passed them around. The bottom line, I said, is that this board has forgotten that they serve the homeowners, not the other way around. They've treated our properties as their personal fiefdoms and our rights as inconveniences. This needs to stop. The room erupted in applause. Deborah's face was scarlet. This is a witch hunt. Everything we've done has been for the good of the community. Seizing my driveway is for the good of the community, I asked. Fining people for having flowers is for the good of the community. Filing fraudulent liens is for the good of the community. We have the authority to enforce standards, she shouted. You have the authority granted to you by the governing documents and state law, Martin said calmly. You've exceeded that authority repeatedly. The Department of Real Estate is investigating. I strongly suggest you consult with competent legal counsel. The meeting devolved into chaos after that. Carol actually started crying. Linda tried to defend their actions but couldn't get a coherent sentence out. Deborah eventually just gathered her things and stormed out, leaving the meeting still technically in session. Bob took over, and the remaining homeowners voted to accelerate the recall election to the following week. We also voted to suspend all enforcement actions pending the recall results and formation of a new board. The recall election was scheduled for a Tuesday evening. I got to the community center early to help set up voting booths. The turnout was massive. People were lined up outside waiting to vote. When the ballots were counted, it wasn't even close. Deborah, Linda, and Carol were all removed from the board by margins of over 80%. A new board was elected with Bob as president, Susan as vice president, and 3 other level-headed homeowners filling the remaining positions. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 days after the recall, I got a call from Officer Hayes. Mr. Zimmerman, you need to come down to the station. We've had a development in your vandalism case. I drove to the Scottsdale Police Department with a sense of foreboding. Officer Hayes met me in the lobby and led me to a small interview room. We received a tip, he explained. Someone claimed to have information about the vandalism incident and several other crimes committed by HOA board members. The tipster provided photos and testimony. We've been investigating and I need to ask you some questions. Okay, I said cautiously. Did Deborah Patterson ever explicitly threaten you? I thought back. Not in those exact words. She made it clear she was going to make my life difficult, but she never said I'm going to hurt you or anything like that. What about property damage? Did you witness her damaging anything other than the spray painting incident we suspect? I have video of her repeatedly trespassing and placing the cone in my driveway, but actual damage? No, just the spray paint, and I didn't catch that on camera. Officer Hayes nodded. The tipster claims that Deborah and Linda Marsh engaged in a scheme to embezzle HOA funds. Allegedly, they created fake invoices for maintenance and legal work that was never performed, then pocketed the money. The tipster provided copies of bank statements and invoices. My jaw dropped. That's embezzlement. Yes, it is. White-collar crime. We're working with the county prosecutor's office on this. I wanted to give you a heads up because you're likely to be called as a witness about the harassment campaign, which may be connected to the embezzlement. Who's the tipster? I can't disclose that, but let's just say someone with intimate knowledge of the HOA's financial operations. I later learned that it was Carol Anderson. She had apparently grown a conscience after the recall, and turned over evidence showing that Deborah and Linda had embezzled nearly $40,000 over 6 months. The fake emergency access designation for my driveway had been part of a larger scheme to increase enforcement actions and justify higher HOA dues and special assessments, which they then skimmed from. The investigation took several weeks. The new HOA board cooperated fully, turning over all financial records. A forensic accountant traced the embezzled funds to personal accounts belonging to Deborah and Linda. Arrests were made on a Thursday morning. I wasn't there, but Bob called me immediately. You're not going to believe this. The police just took Deborah and Linda away in handcuffs for the embezzlement and fraud, and they added charges related to filing the false lien against you. Apparently, that constitutes criminal fraud under Arizona law. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that justice was being done, but sadness that it had come to this. These were people who could have used their positions to genuinely help the community, and instead, they had turned it into a criminal enterprise. The legal proceedings moved forward. Martin helped me file a civil suit against Deborah and Linda for harassment, trespass, and the attempted fraudulent lien. The criminal cases were proceeding in parallel. Carol turned state's evidence and received immunity in exchange for her testimony. She described how Deborah had recruited her and Linda with promises of making the neighborhood great again, but had quickly revealed the financial scheme. Carol had gone along with it at first, intimidated by Deborah's forceful personality, but the recall election had given her the courage to come forward. The criminal trial took place 8 months after my initial confrontation with Deborah over the driveway. I testified about the harassment, the illegal barrier, and the emotional distress of having my property rights violated. Other homeowners testified about similar harassment. The forensic accountant laid out the embezzlement scheme in meticulous detail. Deborah's defense was that she had acted in what she believed was the community's best interest, and that any financial irregularities were bookkeeping errors. The jury didn't buy it. She was convicted of embezzlement, fraud, and criminal trespass. Linda was convicted on similar charges. Deborah was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution of $40,000 plus interest. Linda received 2 years and was also ordered to pay restitution. Both were permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in Arizona. My civil suit settled out of court. Deborah's homeowner's insurance covered most of it, and I received $25,000 in damages. I used part of it to reimburse Bob and the other neighbors who had helped with the recall effort. The new HOA board under Bob's leadership was like night and day. They revised the bylaws to include better checks and balances, required financial transparency with quarterly reports to all homeowners, and established a grievance procedure for anyone who felt they were being unfairly targeted. Enforcement actions had to be based on clearly written rules, and homeowners had the right to appeal to the full board before any fines were imposed. My driveway remained my driveway. No emergency access designation. No barriers. No harassment. I could park my truck there whenever I wanted, as was my right. The neighborhood actually became a better place. People started attending HOA meetings regularly, staying engaged and informed. The board focused on actual community improvements like repairing the playground equipment, organizing neighborhood events, and maintaining common areas. It was what an HOA was supposed to be. I ran into Carol at the grocery store about a year after everything had settled. She looked smaller somehow, worn down by the weight of what had happened. "Frank," she said quietly, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for all of it." I looked at her for a moment. She had enabled Deborah's behavior, but she had also been the one to finally blow the whistle. "You did the right thing in the end. That counts for something." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "I let myself get caught up in something terrible. I thought I was helping the neighborhood, but really I was just afraid to stand up to Deborah." "I'm glad you fought back." "Me too," I said. We went our separate ways and I never saw her again. I heard she moved out of state shortly after. Life returned to normal, or as normal as it gets. I continued working at the construction firm. I kept my security cameras up, just in case, but there were no more incidents. I even became friendly with several neighbors I had never really talked to before. The whole experience had brought the community together in an unexpected way. Bob and I became good friends. We would sometimes sit on my driveway, my actual private driveway that no one was trying to claim anymore, and talk about how crazy the whole situation had been. "You know what the saddest part is?" Bob said one evening. "Deborah could have actually been a good HOA president if she had just focused on legitimate community issues instead of power tripping." "Some people can't handle even a little bit of authority," I replied. "True, but we've proven that homeowners don't have to just accept abuse from their HOA. We can fight back and we can win." That was the real lesson from the whole ordeal. HOAs are supposed to serve the community, not rule over it. Board members are volunteers entrusted with specific, limited powers. They don't get to make up new rules that violate property rights. They don't get to harass residents who disagree with them, and they certainly don't get to embezzle funds. But when HOAs do overstep, homeowners have options: legal action, recall elections, going to the media, organizing with other homeowners. It takes effort and courage, but it's possible to push back against tyranny, even the petty tyranny of an out-of-control HOA. The story made local news when the criminal trials concluded. A reporter from the Arizona Republic wrote a feature article about HOA overreach and used my case as a central example. The article quoted Martin extensively about property rights and the legal limitations on HOA authority. It quoted me about the importance of standing up for yourself, even when it's difficult and expensive. The article generated a lot of discussion. I received emails from people all over Arizona and even other states who were dealing with similar HOA problems. I couldn't help everyone, but I connected people with resources, suggested they contact Martin or other real estate attorneys, and encouraged them to organize with their neighbors. One email stuck with me. It was from a woman in Tucson, whose HOA was trying to force her to remove a wheelchair ramp because it didn't comply with architectural standards. I put her in touch with Martin, who took her case pro bono and quickly resolved it by pointing out that the Fair Housing Act requires HOAs to allow reasonable accommodations for disabilities. The ramp stayed. That was another thing Deborah and her board hadn't understood. HOAs aren't above the law. Federal law, state law, and constitutional protections all supersede HOA rules. An HOA can't enforce a rule that violates fair housing laws, solar access laws, free speech rights, or basic property rights. Too many HOA boards either don't know this or choose to ignore it. About 18 months after the initial confrontation, I was featured on a local radio show talking about HOA issues. The host was fascinated by the story and asked me what advice I would give to other homeowners facing HOA problems. Document everything, I said. Keep copies of all correspondence, take photos and videos, save emails. If you end up in court, you need evidence. Second, know your rights. Read your HOA's governing documents carefully. Read state HOA laws. Don't just accept what the board tells you. Third, get a good lawyer if the situation escalates. It's expensive, but your property rights are worth protecting. And fourth, organize with your neighbors. You're probably not the only one having problems. There's strength in numbers. The host asked if I thought HOAs were inherently problematic. No, I said honestly. HOAs can serve a valuable function when they're run properly. Maintaining common areas, organizing community events, enforcing reasonable standards that everyone agreed to when they bought their property. The problem is when you get people on the board who see it as an opportunity for power and control rather than service. That's when things go off the rails. After the radio show, I got even more messages from people. Some were thank yous for speaking out. Others were questions about specific situations. A few were from HOA board members who wanted to know how to avoid becoming the villain in their own communities. I tried to respond to as many as I could. Life moved on. The notoriety from the case faded. I was no longer that guy with the HOA problem and went back to being just Frank Zimmerman, regular guy who lived at the corner of Maple Ridge Drive and Oak Street. But I never took my property rights for granted again. Every time I pulled into my driveway, I felt a small sense of satisfaction. This was my property. I had fought for it, and I had won. The new HOA board continued to do good work. They established a reserve fund for major repairs, which had been severely depleted by Deborah's embezzlement. They organized a neighborhood cleanup day that brought out dozens of volunteers. They even started a quarterly newsletter to keep everyone informed about board activities and upcoming projects. Property values in the neighborhood actually increased after the recall and cleanup of the HOA. Turns out that when an HOA focuses on legitimate community improvements rather than harassing residents, everyone benefits. People wanted to live in a neighborhood with an engaged, reasonable HOA. I saw Linda once, about 2 years after her conviction. She had served her time and was apparently trying to rebuild her life. She was working at a coffee shop in Phoenix. I was there for a meeting with a client. We made eye contact and she quickly looked away, clearly mortified. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. She had made her choices and paid the price. I never saw Deborah again after the trial. I heard through the grapevine that she moved to Nevada after her release from prison. I hoped she had learned something from the experience, but I doubted it. People like Deborah rarely do. The spray-painted HOA violator on my garage door had long since been cleaned and repainted. The security cameras remained, silent sentinels watching over my property. I had thought about taking them down once everything was resolved, but I decided to keep them. Not out of paranoia, but as a reminder that vigilance is the price of freedom, even freedom as simple as the right to park in your own driveway. My friendship with Bob deepened over time. He turned out to be not just a good neighbor, but a genuinely good person. His term as HOA president lasted 3 years, and under his leadership, the neighborhood transformed from a place of petty rules and enforcement to an actual community where people looked out for each other. When Bob decided not to run for re-election, he had accomplished what he set out to do. The HOA was stable, transparent, and focused on real community needs. His successor, a retired accountant named Margaret Stevens, continued his policies and maintained the positive direction. I occasionally thought about writing a book about my experience. Martin encouraged it, saying it could help other people facing similar situations. But I never got around to it. Maybe someday. What I did do was stay involved in HOA governance. Not as a board member, but as an engaged homeowner who attended meetings, voted in elections, and spoke up when I saw problems developing. I had learned that the best defense against HOA tyranny is an informed and active membership. The legal precedent from my case, particularly the declaratory judgment that the HOA had no right to create easements without proper legal process, was cited in several other Arizona cases. Martin told me it had become part of his standard toolkit when dealing with HOA overreach issues. I also started mentoring other people going through HOA disputes. When someone reached out to me through email or social media, I would sometimes meet them for coffee and walk them through what I had learned. I couldn't give legal advice, but I could share my experience and help them understand their options. One case particularly stood out. A young couple in Mesa was being harassed by their HOA over solar panels, similar to what Jennifer and Marcus had faced. The HOA was threatening daily fines and liens. I connected them with Martin, helped them understand the Arizona solar access laws, and supported them through their fight. They won, and the HOA was ordered to pay their attorney's fees. Last I heard, they had installed those solar panels and were saving hundreds of dollars a month on electricity. That was the thing about fighting back against HOA abuse. When you won, you didn't just help yourself. You helped everyone who came after you. You established precedent. You showed other HOAs that they couldn't get away with illegal behavior. You empowered other homeowners to stand up for their rights. The financial cost of my fight had been significant. Even with the settlement I received, I was probably still out $10,000 or more when all was said and done. But I had no regrets. Some things are worth more than money, and property rights are one of them. Martin and I stayed in touch even after the legal matters were completely resolved. He would occasionally call me when he had a new HOA case and wanted perspective from someone who had been through it. I was always happy to help. 3 years after the initial incident, I was invited to speak at a seminar for HOA board members about governance best practices. It was organized by a property management company that wanted to educate their HOA clients about proper procedures and legal compliance. I was nervous about speaking to a room full of HOA board members, but it turned out to be a good experience. Most of them were genuinely trying to do the right thing and were horrified by stories of board members like Deborah. They wanted to know how to avoid the mistakes that had led to such a spectacular failure. I told them the same things I had been telling individual homeowners. Know the law. Respect property rights. Remember that you serve the community, not rule it. Be transparent with finances. Treat homeowners the way you would want to be treated. It's not complicated, but it requires humility and a genuine desire to serve. After my talk, several board members came up to thank me and ask questions. One woman told me that my story had inspired her HOA to review all their policies, and make sure they were actually authorized by their governing documents. Another man said his board had established a homeowner advisory committee specifically to prevent the kind of disconnect that had occurred in my neighborhood. I left that seminar feeling hopeful. For every Deborah Patterson out there, there were dozens of well-meaning people trying to make their communities better. The key was making sure the good ones stayed engaged and the bad ones were held accountable. My driveway never did become emergency access. The fire department confirmed what Bob had said. There were plenty of access routes through the neighborhood, and my driveway had never been part of any emergency planning. The whole thing had been Deborah's fabrication, probably as a pretext for the control she wanted to exert or possibly as a distraction, while she and Linda embezzled funds. I planted flowers along the edge of the driveway, flowers that I chose without asking anyone's permission. They were beautiful purple and yellow blooms that attracted butterflies. They made me smile every time I came home. That was what home ownership should be. The freedom to enjoy your property, to make it yours, to plant flowers or park your truck, or paint your front door without someone with a clipboard telling you that you're violating some made-up rule. Years passed. The whole incident became part of neighborhood lore, a cautionary tale told to new residents about what happens when HOA boards go bad, and what happens when homeowners fight back. It was a story with a happy ending, or as happy as could be expected given that it involved criminal convictions and prison time. I never moved. This was my home. I had fought for it, and I wasn't going anywhere. My truck sat in my driveway every night exactly where it belonged. No cones, no barriers, no harassment. Just my property, my rights, my home. And that was worth everything I had gone through to protect it.